All right. I've titled this, Prepare Him for Crucifixion. Always is such a joyful topic here. But it wouldn't be in the Bible if it wasn't important. And I think the artists have done us a great disservice in making it seem much tamer than it really was. And we have to understand what Jesus Christ went through for us, and then it's a lot easier for us to put our life down, for somebody else. So today we're going to cover the period of time between the arrest and the crucifixion. And there had been a lifetime of learning, and it took an eternity to set this learning up. Everything was happening just as God had told his prophets for thousands of years that it would happen. All of the events were true, and the characters were real. So here's a quick review. It was probably the night before the big feast, the Passover sacrifice and meal. And people from all over the world, the known world, were in Jerusalem. It was packed. And the night was bright, and there was a slight chill in the air. Remember, it's early spring. It was almost a full moon, because Passover is always done on a full moon. And the Last Supper had ended, and Jesus and the 11 were walking up one side, probably the south side of the Mount of Olives, and he was teaching, and he was sharing, and they were doing some praying. At the same time, Judas was leading possibly 600 guys up the north side of the Mount of Olives. And one of Jesus' hand-picked men had become a traitor and had betrayed him. The pressure was mounting, and Jesus knew he was walking into a night of unimaginable cruelty and torture that would end in his death. He knew this. And after a particularly intense prayer, Jesus literally sweated blood and then gathered his 11 apostles together and was immediately surrounded by the menacing mob. And Judas walked up and kissed him on the head to show the temple guard which one was Jesus. Not everybody knew Jesus. And the crowd was so closely packed together that when Jesus acknowledged who he was and took a little step forward, they took a little step backward, stumbled into each other, and fell down like dominoes. Imagine almost 600 people falling backwards. Might have been a little embarrassing for them. Well, the temple guards got up and they started reaching and they grabbed Jesus. And Peter pulled out his long fishing knife, which he was very good with, and he sliced the ear of one of the temple guards, a guy named Malchus. And then Jesus immediately reaches out, touches this guy's ear, and heals him. It's a whole nother level of healing here. I'm sure he didn't want Jesus to touch him. This was a guy that they hated, and they were going to arrest. And now the guy you're about to arrest grabs your head. Wouldn't be a good deal. And Jesus told Peter that if you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. And by this, he put the knife away, and basically Jesus saved the apostles' lives at that point. He needed them to keep going. If it had to turn into a big brawl, then who would have carried it on? These guys were just barely hanging in there. And all the apostles ran away at that point. I probably would have done it too. 600 against 11, that's not very good odds. So they had Jesus in tow now. Maybe they had him tied up, maybe not sure. And so all these guys, these guys ran, and Jesus Christ was alone now with his captors. And Jesus had predicted that every one of them was going to leave him. And his prediction came true. And this murderous mob began to escort Jesus down the Mount of Olives, across the brook, and up the hill back into Jerusalem. And the temple area was right in that area, near that eastern wall entry. It was only a few hundred yards away. It wasn't like miles. It's like going across the street here and then coming back up. It wasn't that far. And a young man, a friend of Jesus who had not been invited to the Last Supper, had not been invited to this final time of being with Jesus, must have heard that something was going down. And he quickly left his house without getting fully dressed and went for a look-see. He must have known they were going to this Mount of Olives. So this young man tracks him there. And Peter also began to stalk this crowd that was taking Jesus. Yet it says in the Bible that he stayed at a safe distance, much safer than this bold young man who ran right up to the crowd. So go to Mark chapter 14. And we're going to start in verse 43. And I'm going to read this from a newer translation called The Voice. The Voice. And verse 43. Before he had finished talking, Judas, one of the 12, approached with a large group of people, agents of the chief priests, scribes, and elders in Jerusalem, armed with swords and clubs. 44. The signal they had arranged was a kiss. Watch to see who I kiss. He's the one, Judas had told them. Arrest him and take him into secure custody. As soon as they arrived, Judas stepped forward, kissing Jesus, and said, My teacher, Rabbi. And immediately the soldiers grabbed Jesus and took him into custody. Now one of the disciples standing close by drew his sword and swung, cutting off the ear of a slave of Caiaphas, the high priest, servant. And Jesus, calling out, said, Am I a thief and a bandit that you have come armed with swords and clubs to capture me? I sat teaching in the temple every day with you. You could have taken me at any time, but you never did. Let the scriptures be fulfilled. Verse 50, when they saw the armed crowd take Jesus into custody, the disciples fled. And one of those following Jesus was a young man who was wearing nothing but a linen cloth, a robe. When people from the mob grabbed him, he wiggled out of their grasp and left them holding the cloth and ran naked into the night. Zach the Streak, or Lazarus the Streak, should I say. And now it's almost a 2-for-1 special here. And why would these alert young men that were with the elders of the Israel attached to this temple mob that had just apprehended Jesus try to grab this particular young man? You know, why didn't they try to arrest Peter, who had just attacked and cut one of their own? Wouldn't that be normal? Retaliation? You know, they didn't try to hunt down the other apostles either. Why this young man? Who was this young man and why was he mentioned here? And in John chapter 12, we're going to read 9 through 11. It explains, and this record happened what I'm about to read happened about a week prior to the events of this night on the Mount of Olives, but it'll help explain. And the verse 9 of John 12, word spread of Jesus' presence, and a large crowd was gathering to see Jesus and the formerly deceased Lazarus, whom he had brought back from the dead. The chief priests were secretly plotting Lazarus' murder since. Because of him, many Jews were leaving their teaching and believing in Jesus. This naked young man must have been Lazarus. See, the chief priests wanted to kill him too. Remember, the hit out was on him, just like it was out on Jesus. They wanted to get rid of the evidence. Hoffa style. You know, he was number 2 on the religious leaders' most wanted list. Jesus was number 1. And this would have been a 2-for-1 special had they actually caught Lazarus. They would have killed him too. Isn't that just flat out nuts? That's religion. Another indicator of who this young man was the linen robe he wore. Now, linen to us doesn't mean much, but linen was only worn by the elite. It was only worn, it was imported material. It was worn by rich people. So it would have been like a fancy outfit, you know, a fancy suit made in London or something. You know, it would have been fancy. But now this guy was naked. You know, and you think, well, how could religious people actually do this? Well, I was in somebody's house the other day and started talking about Jesus Christ, and I was telling him a couple of times, talking to this guy, told him a couple of times I had been, had my life threatened. You know, twice with pistols, and once was pushed into this machine because they didn't like what I was saying. And so he assumed that I was talking about about who most Christians think Jesus Christ is. And he thought it would have been a worthy punishment for me to have died at that time. And that's some, you know, I mean, that's religion. That's religion. And so this guy, now we're talking about an illegal night trial. This was against Judean law, but they did it anyway. They had to do it because probably that same day or the very next day was Passover, and they couldn't do it then. Too many things were happening too fast. And so now the Judean leaders had to determine the best way to trick the Romans into doing their dirty work and crucifying Jesus. Manipulating politicians. Probably had never been done before, and it probably has been done since then, you know. And tongue-in-cheek, of course. And so in this guy, Jesus, was high profile, and they didn't want the Romans messing things up. It had to happen today. And so they first brought Jesus to a shrewd old manipulator, the previous high priest named Annas. Or you could change the pronunciation if you would like. And he knew how to manipulate the law. He knew how to manipulate the Judeans. And he knew how to manipulate the Romans. And the fear surrounding Roman rule of law will be used against the Romans. He knew this. He laid out the plan, and he knew it would work. He knew it would work. Next, the mob took Jesus to see, after they left Annas' house, then they took him to see the current high priest, a guy named Caiaphas, who was actually related to Annas. And this is the guy that had to do the dirty work. He was the one who had to deal directly with the Roman governor Pilate, who would not have been that pleasant to deal with, especially early in the morning, when a city's full of foreigners. You think the Roman guard was on high alert? Think about it. They're on high alert. There's people from all over the Roman Empire there for this celebration. So just think about the emotions and the tension that had to be in everybody. And this would have been very obvious what was about to happen. So let the torture begin. Mark 14, 53 and 54 from the Voice. And they led Jesus off to see the high gathered a council of religious leaders and civic leaders, scribes, chief priests, and elders to hear the evidence and render some decision regarding Jesus. Peter followed at a safe distance, all the way into the courtyard of the high priest, and he sat down with the guards to warm himself at their fire. He hoped no one would notice. Of course, I'm sure those black glasses and that fake nose would have helped, the mustache. But how scary would that be for Peter? What if he saw that guy whose ear he cut? You think that guy would recognize him? If somebody got healed back on, that might make an impression. How bold would Peter have been to do this? Now remember, he denied Jesus a bunch of times here, but he did it to save his own skin. Now verse 64, skip a little bit. High priest to the council. What else do we need to hear? You've heard the blasphemy from his own lips. What do you have to say about that? The verdict was unanimous. Jesus was guilty of a capital crime. 65. So the people began to humiliate him. Now, what people are here? What people are these? These are the Judeans here. They haven't yet gone to the Romans yet. And so the people began to humiliate him. Some even spat upon him. So they're walking around. He's probably in the center, and they're just hacking on him. And he was blindfolded, or they put a bag on his head, and they slapped and punched him. It says with open palms. They buffeted him and they hit him with open palms. So what do they call it? Bitch slapping? I mean, they're doing this to Jesus. Pretty crazy stuff. And these are the religious guys. And here are the people. Come on, prophet, prophesy for us. Tell us who just hit you. Boom. Tell us who just hit you. Boom. Then the guards took him, beating him as they did so. So these are the nice religious people. These are the religious leaders and their staff who were attacking, taunting, and beating. Now they had sentenced him to death. It didn't matter what they did, to a point, because they still nobody else. And the high priest knew exactly how far they could go with this beating before the Romans would act negatively. I mean, they knew exactly how far they could go. They knew what the Romans would allow. This was already planned, all this stuff. They just couldn't resist a little punishment before they got the Romans involved. After all, they've been planning and anticipating this moment for months. Judas was the key that allowed him to get arrested. The devil had been anticipating this for thousands of years and really planning it out since Adam and Eve. Think about all the times he tried to kill off the Christ line. I mean, I don't want to take the time now, but it's amazing. Isaiah 56, don't turn there, but it prophesies that they were going to pluck the hair off of his face. You ever had your hair yanked out? You know, maybe in a fight or through a machine or something? Not fun. You know, it wasn't an uncommon thing for the Judeans to do this when they held somebody in captivity. And remember, a man's beard was very important. And so to yank off their beard or to cut off their beard was a great disgrace. And sometimes they would go off and have to and wait for it to grow back before they'd come back into public. Like, I'm going to tell you in just a second here. Nehemiah 13:5 says, it talks about pulling the hair off a fellow Israelite to make a point. So they did this stuff. And if it's prophesied in the Bible, so what happened to him? Whether it's written in the Gospels or not, they yanked his hair off his face. The Jews were not gentle with Jesus, manipulating the Romans. Now the crowd brought the well-beaten Jesus to Pilate. Now they had just done it with fists and hands. You know, they hadn't really used any enhanced weaponry, except for they pulled at least part of his beard off his face. And so they brought him to Pilate now. And he was the governor of the portion of Israel called Judea. And there's different parts of Israel the Romans had separated. You had Judea, you had Galilee up in the north. Then on the east side of the Jordan River was Perea. That was another province that they would have a governor over each of these. And then south of Judea there'd be another one below the Red Sea. So they had 4 or 5 provinces. And so this guy right here, Pilate, was the one over Judea. That's where Jerusalem was. And they needed the Romans to carry out this particular death sentence because they had religious duties to perform that day. Can't get my hands dirty. And they were positive that the Romans would give in. Capital punishment for capital gain. And remember, the Romans had occupied Israel and all the surrounding countries for about 100 years. Imagine our country taken over for 100 years by the Chinese. Would it change our culture? Oh, yeah. Or the Russians or the Germans or, you name somebody. And both sides knew how to play each other. And it was all about keeping the peace and making yourself look good in the process. You bend the laws, but don't look like you're breaking them. We wouldn't want to make Rome look bad now, would we? And Pilate didn't want this case. And he knew he was getting played by these Jews. Jesus was from Galilee, another province. He sent him to Herod, who was in town for the celebration. Now remember, Herod's dad was Herod the Great. Herod the Great rebuilt the temple and built for himself and his family a palace or center of Jerusalem. So this was just another one of Herod's homes. He had some up in Galilee. He had the one in Jerusalem, and we know from a previous teaching he had one south of the sea, the Dead Sea. So here he sent him to Herod. It was just it wasn't maybe a quarter mile, just a few blocks from where Pilate was, and so now the Romans are fully involved. Now it isn't just the religious people moving this guy along. Once they took him to Herod and did this, now Herod had to have his men of war lead him through the streets to Herod's house. Already he's not looking so good. Now, so they sent him to Herod. Now the father of this Herod was Herod the Great. He was the one who wanted to kill baby Jesus, Herod the Great, his dad. The younger Herod, this Herod we're talking about today is Herod Antipas. And he had heard of this guy Jesus. He had heard of the wise men from the east who had tricked his dad and sought out this new king of Israel that had been born. You've all heard the story. And Jesus was a toddler at that time. And Herod the Great he had pretty much offed all the kids. He'd killed all the kids who were 2 years and younger. So that means Jesus was just under 2 years old at that time. If you read the Bible, you realize that it doesn't take much research. The wise men came when Jesus was a toddler. Came to a house that doesn't say manger. But, we don't want to mess up the artwork. And so, just to get scripture accurate. Pity. And now this Herod Antipas was also a unique, bloody man. He a few months prior, at the request of his daughter, had beheaded the cousin of Jesus named John the Baptist. That was this guy. You think he cared? He didn't care. A few years after the death of Jesus, another relative called Herod Agrippa, Apostle James, just to make the Jews happy. This is a bloody family. Now, and I want you to know that they had converted to Judaism way back when, but they didn't practice. So all the Herods were all of the, they all had converted at one point to Judaism. So you see, there's a crazy connections here. Now, they weren't practicing, nor were they liked by the Jews. But they were forced to convert at one time. So it wasn't a nice family. Luke chapter 23, starting in verse 6. Pilate. Just a minute. Is this man a Galilean? When Pilate learned that Jesus was indeed a Galilean, which meant he was officially under Herod's jurisdiction, Pilate sent him over to Herod, who was currently in Jerusalem. Herod was fascinated to meet Jesus, for he had heard about him for a long time. He just killed he just recently, or half a year ago, killed his cousin. Cousin surely talked about the Christ, because that was his whole purpose of life, to prepare the way for Jesus Christ. He had heard about baby Jesus. Oh my. And he was hoping to be treated to a miracle or two. See, Herod wants Jesus to dress up like a clown and do some party tricks. Imagine little hands. Woohoo! Jesus is here. I've been waiting for this moment. It's that fat little turd, you know, Herod. You know, I mean, and he was anticipating Jesus putting on a show for him, doing some kind of entertainment, just a miracle or two. It's ridiculous. Like a court jester. Verse 9, he interrogated Jesus for quite a while, but Jesus remained silent, refusing to answer his questions. He's no fun. Think that would make Herod mad? If you think you're the boss and now you're asking questions and the guy is just not saying a word, it pissed him off. Meanwhile, the chief priests and religious scholars had plenty to say, angrily hurling accusations at Jesus. So they're in this open courtyard, apparently, of this. They're just screaming at what they want Herod to do. Eventually, Herod and his soldiers began to insult Jesus, mocking and degrading him. So now these soldiers and Herod are starting to give in. You see how the plan's beginning to work? Annas knew exactly how to work this thing. He knew exactly what was going to happen. And they put expensive clothing on him and sent him back to Pilate. And this ended a long-standing rift between Herod and Pilate, and they became friends from that day forward. They hated each other before that day, but now mocking and treating Christ like this, now they're friends. See, Herod and his men of war treated Jesus very poorly. Of what was on him, and then they put on a radiant or magnificent robe. It was a designer robe of some kind. He said it's brilliant. It was so bright it hurt your eyes. Either it was white, or it was like gold threads. It was something magnificent they put on him. Pilate loved it. He loved the thought, because this is the guy they're calling the King of the Jews, and now he's wearing this princely robe, this resplendent robe, this luxurious designer robe. He sent him back to him in that thing. Now, the word mock means to toy with or to make sport of something. And it has different connotations. It never says the Judeans mocked him, but both Herod's men and Pilate's men mocked him. So I won't say any more on this because I really don't know. But we know the Romans weren't too nice with their captives. And they send him back so he sends him back to Pilate, and his royal palace is only a few blocks away. And now John 19, verse 1. This is also from The Voice. Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. So now this guy comes in this wonderful looking robe. Take this robe off of him, fold it up. Now who's probably going to keep this robe? Pilate. It's probably worth a lot of money. But Herod's family basically owned, so much of Jerusalem. And so they flogged him. They beat him with whips. And the soldiers twisted thorny branches together as a crown and placed it onto his brow and wrapped him in a purple cloth or a purple robe. So this isn't the same robe now. First they'd taken off Jesus' original robe. You see, then they put on that fancy one. And then they put on this purple one. And they drew near to him shouting. Now remember, every time, if you were bleeding, every time a piece of clothing would be pulled back off of you, if it had had time to dry, it would reopen those wounds. You'd pull the scabs back off. And the soldiers, striking at Jesus, bow down, everyone. This is the King of the Jews. So they put this royal robe on him, and they put this crown of thorns on him. You see, and then they shout out, bow down. And you can see all the Roman soldiers just all falling to the knee. Chink. And remember, these guys wore their armor all the time. They were never without it. They had that shield. They had the sword. They had all 5 implements. They had these studded sandals. Everywhere they walked, it would make this noise on the stone. All these guys at the same time, boom. And we'll find out that there was a lot of these guys, but we'll get to that in a minute. Bow down. This is the King of the Jews. Pilate going out to the crowd. Now he walks out where the whole crowd was. So he's leaving where the soldiers were, and he said, listen, I stand in front of you with this man to make myself clear. I find this man innocent of any crimes. Then Jesus was paraded out before the people, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. They paraded him. So probably a couple of soldiers took him, and they just walked him around. Now remember, he wasn't looking so pretty by that point. He has spit mixed in with sweat and blood, all over his head. Not, open wounds. What would that feel like? And then Pilate said, here is the man. And the chief priests and officers shouting, crucify him! Crucify him! Now, is that the Judeans' form of capital punishment? No. What was their form of capital punishment? Stoning to death. Still nasty. Now remember, the Romans would let the Judeans take care of their own problems quite a bit. Because remember, they were going to stone that one woman to death who was caught in the very act of adultery. Remember that back earlier in the Gospels? So there was latitude. They could kill if they wanted to kill, if it dealt with their laws. But we're going to see the manipulation here. Watch this. It's just one layer. It was so wonderfully laid out, by Annas and Caiaphas. Not wonderful to us. And he says, they said, crucify, crucify. And Pilate, you take him and crucify him. I have declared him not guilty of any punishable crime. The Jews, our law says that he should die because he claims to be the Son of God. And Pilate's like, what? Now see, Pilate was terrified to hear the Jews making their claims for his execution. So he retired to his court, the Praetorium. See, he didn't want to judge on a religious matter. It's like, what? He just had this guy beat and mocked by some of his men and paraded around in this robe. And now he's realizing it's a religious thing. So he goes back inside. And then Pilate said, where are you from? Jesus didn't speak. Pilate, how can you ignore me? Are you not aware that I have the authority either to free you or crucify you? Jesus, any authority you have over me comes from above, not from your political position. Because of this, the one who handed me to you is guilty of the greater sin. Which was who? Well, or the chief priests. And Pilate listened to Jesus' words, taking them to heart. He attempted to release Jesus, but the Jews opposed him, shouting, the Jews, if you release this man, you have betrayed Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king threatens Caesar's throne. Now you see what happened here? You see, after Pilate heard these accusations, he sent Jesus out and took his seat in the place where he rendered judgment. So he sat down at his official judgment seat now. And he'd have the desk with all the papers on it and the 10 pens, to sign each one with a different pen so they could hand it to all the different people, all the little girls standing behind him and, all dressed up nicely. And you know how the politicians do all that. They make quite a show. So he's in this special place where he rendered judgment. The place was called the pavement, or Gabbatha in Hebrew. See, now you're going to see Pilate switch gears. Once he knew his job or his reputation was threatened, watch what he does. And all this occurred at the 6th hour on the day everyone prepares for the Passover, which would have been about what time? Noon. Pilate to the Jews, look, here's your king. Your king, the Jews, put him away, crucify him. Imagine all these people screaming this out. And then Pilate says, you want me to crucify your king? Chief priests, we have no king but Caesar. You think they really felt that in their heart? No, they hated Caesar. But this is a manipulation. Pilate handed him over to his soldiers, knowing that he would be crucified. Pretty crazy. But you see the brilliant manipulation of the Roman government by these brilliant strategists, of the Hebrew people. I mean, it's something. And then that last thing, once they said that, then he had to kill Jesus Christ. Because all these men are listening. All these people are in this courtyard. All these people from the Roman Empire are there. Other governors from other provinces are there because it's a huge deal. everybody's going to hear what just happened. So to save his own skin, he takes Jesus' life. Pilate caved. Now, Pilate's position was threatened. He caved just like the Jewish religious leaders knew he would. And Pilate hands Jesus over to his men, and they take him into a common area of the palace where there were about 600 others. It was called a cohort. They knew exactly what to do with a traitor. To them, he was a condemned man. And they had done this hundreds of times before. Remember, just less than 100 years before that, they had just crucified 6,000 people, the Romans did, on the Appian Way, just south of Rome. Spartacus, you've heard of Spartacus, right? His men. They killed most of them, and they strung up, they hung up, pinned up 6,000 people. And Israel was covered with areas where there was crucified people, there. Everybody knew this. Everybody saw this. We'll get more into this next week. Such fun. And they'd done this hundreds of times before. Remember, Jesus had been sentenced to death as a traitor and a threat to Caesar, the emperor. And these guys were merciless. And all they had to do was keep him alive long enough for him to feel the pain of crucifixion. These guys just beat the hell out of Jesus. And what else did they do to him? I'm going to move quick here, but Psalm 129 from The Voice says, and this is a song for those journeying to worship in Jerusalem. Quote, "This is not the first time my enemies assaulted me. They have often attacked me since I was young." So he'd been attacked before. Prophesied, "So let Israel now proclaim, this is not the first time my enemies assaulted me." Oh, I already said that. They attacked me since I was young, and they've not been able to overpower me. The plowers plowed upon me. They plowed their furrows deep and long down my back. Now, this is a song that all people walking to Jerusalem would sing. They would sing songs about what the Messiah was going to go through and how God would deliver him. This is one thing that happened. So whatever they did, and the Romans, one of the ways they would punish people about to be crucified so they would die quicker is they would have whips with pieces of metal at the end, sharp pieces of metal, maybe even bone or stone. And then they would whip. And imagine having a whip. It could just open up a whole back. And it says, so it was just, head to toe they hurt this guy, probably front to back. And they sang this psalm, and others like it. Psalm 120 to 134 were called the songs of degrees or steps. And at different places on the way to Jerusalem, they would sing these songs. The families would. Imagine all the different families singing these things, sometimes joining into unison. And this is one of them. Don't know the tune, don't want to. And they were all short, and each addressed a specific human problem that the Messiah was going to face that ended in deliverance from God. They described the attack and the stand of the Messiah. So crucifixion was usually preceded by this beating. It'd be like being beat with barbed wire. You ever got caught in barbed wire? I have. Running through fields at night, and you get hung up on it when I was a kid in Texas. It's no fun. You got to pull yourself off of there, and you got all these holes in you. Well, imagine, getting run through that, like hitting it on a snowmobile, it would do something different. So, they beat them so they couldn't resist or want to get off. They were experts in the art of death, and they knew exactly how far to take it to keep somebody alive. And that's typically what they would do to somebody who was thought of like this. Now remember, once you were tried for a capital crime, the Romans no longer considered you a human being. You were just a thing. So it didn't mean anything anymore. Whatever they did to you, it wasn't like beating a human. It'd be like beating a stick, a wall. And remember, these guys had done this type of beating many times. Some of them maybe hundreds of times. And in the back, his body looked like a plowed field. And it reminded them of what this song reminded them what Christ was going to have to go through. And these furrows were long and they were purposeful. Now, these guys would have been experts. They would have said, watch what I'm going to do, bud, and just cut somebody from head to toe. You think these guys would have played around? Sure they would. They didn't care. Yeah, it wasn't even a few hundred years ago we thought of people who looked different as being non-human. Look what happened in World War II. Both the Germans and the Japanese thought of certain races as being not human. So they could do anything they wanted to them. It's sad stuff. So from the time Jesus learned to sing, he would have sang this song. And his mom would have told him, that's going to happen to you, buddy. Be strong. Imagine knowing the prophecy of what was going to happen to your child and have to help them fulfill this thing. It's crazy. The Message Bible simply states in Isaiah 52:14 that he didn't even look human. A ruined face, disfigured past recognition. So Jesus Christ, he did not even look like a human anymore. Nobody would have a picture of him in their Bible. Unrecognizable. And I always wondered why he was not able to carry his own post or cross the 300 or so yards to the place of the crucifixion. And here's a few thoughts I had yesterday when I was on a little jog. And, he received the death sentence for calling himself the king. So they treated him differently than a common criminal, a robber. You see, this was a crime that affected their positions and their jobs. He would have been treated more harshly than most. Okay? He would have also been the perfect physical specimen of a human. Remember perfect blood? Probably nobody ever looked better than Jesus Christ. Think there's any jealousy there? Plus, he had a huge following, and people were turning away from Judaism. So, and it says also in the Bible that Pilate knew that these guys were jealous of Jesus, that the religious people. So jealousy's there. He'd already been beat by the Judeans, possibly Herod's men of war. And he's beat by Pilate's men before the sentence. And now he's with maybe 600 young men looking for a way to release. Tension's on. The town is full. And remember, when someone's convicted for a crime of treason, he was considered a slave and no longer considered a human. Now you also see when he was given 30 pieces of silver, when Judas was, that's the price of a dead slave. The Jews knew exactly what was going to happen. Isn't that crazy? Jesus was just an object to be thrown away. And here's something different that I'm going to share with you today. They also dislocated his joints. And that's prophesied. And Psalm 22 says, one verse in there says, my life is poured out like water. All my bones have slipped out of joint. The Message says, every joint in my body has been pulled apart. What did the Romans do to him in there? Now you see why he couldn't even lift his arms to hold that post. You ever had your arm, you ever had your bones disjointed? It hurts. They would have twisted his arms. Who knows what they were doing to him? Maybe he was trying to struggle free. These guys knew how to kill with their bare hands. These guys, these legionnaires, they were not people to be messed with. When you're carrying around 100-something pounds or more all day long, every day, you're going to be fairly strong. And they'd never come up against somebody like Jesus. They pulled him apart. Twisted out of joint. He may not have been able to walk, much less raise his limp arms to carry anything. After he'd been thoroughly beaten and pulled from limb to limb, they take him out of the praetorium and walk past a pile of well-used posts. You can sort of picture this. It's daylight now. The Romans would have had a pile of those things, probably stacked up real nice like at Home Depot, you know, and you got to remember, they used the easiest thing possible to crucify people on. Sometimes they use crosses. Sometimes they just use posts. Sometimes they use live trees. Sometimes they use just pieces of planks of wood. We don't know. We're going to get more into that next Sunday. And so they walk past this pile of well-used posts or crosses. And this was the moment that the devil had dreamed of and planned for since he quit God's team and got ejected from heaven. He had tried to kill the Christ even before he was born. Tried to kill him as a child. Tried to kill him during the temptations at the beginning of his ministry. And then again now. The devil, well, before he almost got stoned one time, right? And he walked right through the crowd and they didn't even notice him. The storms at the seas. It wasn't God making those storms. The devil wanted to drown the Christ. Of course, when you can walk on water, you know, no, it's not like he just walked around on water, but it's just a funny thought. Who needs a life preserver? You know, the devil thinks he's almost won. Can you imagine? He can all but taste a sweet taste of victory. All he has to do is one thing, get Jesus just to lose focus for a second. Just a second, and he won't be the Savior of mankind. I've almost got him. Jesus steals his mind. He sets his face like a flint, and he steps out of the praetorium into the light. His whole life has led up to this point. He knows he is going to be the Passover sacrifice. And he says in his mind, it's game time. God bless.